All right, well, look at 1 Timothy chapter 3. Maybe if I go off this. I don't know. And turn to verse 15. Sometimes when you unplug it and plug it, it fixes. If you look at chapter 3, verse 15, I think this is really the purpose of the letter. I had it here on the screen, but we can just read it until we figure it out. This is what Paul says. He says, "But in case I am delayed, I write so that you will know how one ought to conduct himself in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and support of the truth." And I think this is a good way to understand the whole letter and to understand how it's applicable to each of us. Us Christians, as part of the church, are learning through Timothy how to live as the church. Yeah, we can try. Well, no, I can move over there. Just try unplugging it and plugging it in one more time. I have a lot of things open. If you reboot it, it's going to be very bad. Please. Really? Bummer. Most weeks it's just worked if I unplug it and plug it back in. But all right, so you see verse 15, chapter 3, verse 15. He's telling Timothy that he's writing to Timothy so that the church would know, so that people would know how to behave in the church. So we are Christians in the church. Matthew Laird's amazing. There, now you see it on the screen. Most of us do right now, so it's okay. All right, so now we can write on the screen and everything. All right, so you may know how one, and we understand ourselves to be part of this one, ought to behave in the household of God. So what does it look like for Christians to be a part of the church? That's kind of the big thing that he's saying here in the book. And that's important to keep in mind, especially when we're talking about things that are more controversial, like we did last week, or this week we'll be focusing on elders and deacons. It's still important for you and for me, whether or not you're an elder or a deacon, to understand how you should live in the church. Now, I thought quickly, let's just go back and read the controversial verses because we rushed through them last time just for lack of time. Now, if you see here in chapter 2, verses 8, Paul gives a male-specific argument first. Men should pray lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling, which I explained as men are sometimes predisposed to anger, and so Paul is encouraging them to live and to operate in the church with a posture of dependence, raising your hand, praying, which is dependence, rather than anger. And then women, likewise, Paul says that they should adorn themselves in a way that doesn't draw attention to themselves. The way we defined modesty is dressing or acting in such a way that you don't stand out. So that could obviously change based on the group that you're with and the culture that you're in. But what should be standing out is, let's see, how does he say? The next verse is here. Good works. And obviously this is something that should be standing out for all of us as Christians, right? And we talked about last time how men can be immodest. Maybe I gave the example of a guy who works out all the time and wears muscle shirts all the time. I think that could be immodest in a sense because you're drawing attention to yourself and your amazing muscles, rather than your good works. And then he goes on into, let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. And here, the way that we understood this is he's talking here about teaching and exercising authority. And remember, because of chapter 3, verse 15, he's talking about how people should behave in the church. And so I take these verses as saying not that a woman should, never say anything and be quiet all the time, but that God has not designed women to be teachers in the church and elders in the church. And as we'll see today, the elder role or the pastor role includes both authority and teaching, these things that Paul is saying that women should not do in a church. And then in verse 13, Paul roots what he's saying not in the culture, and this is important because some people would say that what he's saying in verse 12 and what he's saying in verse 11 are just cultural things. So it was only true back then, but it's not true today. But Paul speaks against that by rooting it in creation. So he goes all the way back to Adam and then Eve. And he says, Adam was formed first, then Eve. Now, the significance of this, if we had time, we could go back to Genesis and see that Adam is created first and kind of given dominion to over the garden. So he's kind of put in charge. And then Eve is created afterwards to help him. So that's what he's referring to here with the Adam created first aspect. It's kind of the leadership aspect. And then when he says here, this is interesting because I read today in a commentary, apparently people have taken this phrase to, throughout church history that women are more easily deceived. And I don't think that's true. Well, the way the commentator put it, I thought was really good. He said that women are weaker in some areas and men are weaker in some areas, and men are stronger in some areas and women are stronger in some areas. Now, he gave the example of when it comes to drugs, for example, men are 6 times more likely to abuse drugs. Men are 10 times more likely to abuse alcohol, and virtually all rapes come from men. So those are just some examples of areas that men are more weak than women. And of course, those are generalities. But anyway, here, the way that I take verse 14, it's not saying that women are just easily deceived and men aren't. But I take it that Eve was operating in Eden outside of her role. And Adam was also operating outside of his role. He should have been protecting, he should have been leading her, and they should have been deciding with the fruit together. But Eve rather takes it in her own hands and eats it and then leads him to eat it. So that's how I take that there. Any questions on all of that? That's just a quick summary of how I take these verses. Now, of course, these are complex issues, and I'm just giving a general summary, and people argue about all of this. But that's what I take Paul to be doing in this section. If you want a parallel passage to read on your own, it's 1 Peter 3, I think, where Peter talks about some of the same themes. Yeah.
If you don't want to go into this, some of the questions I received, another idea of what it means.
Right.
If you don't want to touch on that, you ask the questions.
I don't know exactly where you're going, but some people, I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Rick Warren controversy that just happened. He was kicked out of the Southern Baptist Convention because they have women pastors. But the way that they understand it is very nuanced. So listen to this. Rick Warren's church. So they perceive that, I don't know how they take this verse, but basically how they understand it, if I'm not getting it wrong, is that elders are supposed to oversee all the teaching of the church, but they can delegate it to women as pastors. So what they're doing is they are separating the role of elder and the role of pastor, and they are saying that those are two different roles, and an elder can oversee a woman pastor. So I think that they would probably take this to say that the ultimate authority over the teaching couldn't be a woman. I don't know. Now, is that related to how you've received a question, or is it completely different?
That's a really good point. It's not what I was saying, but I thought it was really
What was your point?
just the idea of women reading scripture.
Oh. Yeah, I don't think that's teaching, but teaching is taking the Word of God and explaining it. So that's how I take it. And again, like we talked about last week, this isn't based on skill. So Paul's also not saying that men are more skilled to teach the Bible and women just don't have the ability. That's not what he's saying at all. I think what he's saying is that God has designed things this way all the way from creation just to point to Christ. It's really just to point to Jesus and the way that he's designed the world. It's not to point out inherent weaknesses and strengths of the genders. Although yeah. This is the kind of topic where you really shouldn't talk without planning what you're going to talk. So I'll try to just stop. Now, the next verse here is very confusing. Yet she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith and love and holiness. I think I pointed out last week, some people take this as referring to Eve, which is kind of in the context. Eve is back here. Oh no, I skipped past Eve. Right here. So that's the she here. Eve brought salvation through the bearing of Christ. Now, I think that does not make sense, really, in the context here. The way that I see it is that he's talking about women in general will be best fulfilled or delivered. I think the New American Standard uses preservation. So they're going to avoid the tendencies towards immodesty or rule or any of the things that women shouldn't be moving towards. They will avoid those and be delivered from those things through motherhood. That's how I kind of take it. So that's what he means by through childbearing. And I think that means, for those who actually have children, it's through actually being mothers. And for those who don't have children, it's being motherly or being a mother towards others in the church. And I think this is a big distinction between men and women. Men are meant to grow into fathers, both of their own children and the other children and young men in the church. And women are supposed to grow into mothers, both of their own children and the other children in the church. That's why he also says the older men teach the younger men, the older women teach the younger women. Now, the other interpretation of this is that women will be saved in spite of childbearing. And so they're taking this word here to mean, the example I saw was like if you saved someone experienced a fire but was saved through the fire. So they made it through the fire. And so they were taking this verse to say women will be saved in spite of childbearing. So take it for what you will. That's probably enough time on this verse. But notice here too, if we go back to just showing things in context, right? That Paul emphasizes the good works here. And it seems what he's doing in verse 15 is just explaining those, faith, love, holiness with self-control. All right, any other questions on that? I just wanted to give the opportunity since we didn't have as much time last time. Yeah? Huh? She was saved with the first one, the first child. Yeah. So obviously, some people have proposed that it literally means saving, like saving from sin, or something similar. What? Oh, okay. All right, so let's move on. Chapter 3. This is where, that's 1 Peter. I meant if we had time last week to go over it. This is the parallel passage in 1 Peter. Now, this is 1 Timothy 3. And now he kind of changes gears, but really he's not changing gears that much. He just talked about men, he just talked about women, and now he's talking about elders. So notice here he says, the saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires or desires the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Now, there's a couple things to point out in this verse. First, the office of overseer. I was taught in seminary that this word overseer is synonymous with elder and pastor. So these are all synonyms that emphasize different aspects of the role of pastor. Now, remember the example I just gave from Rick Warren's church that they've divided these two here? Now, admittedly, pastor is the less... there's an argument to be made that pastor is just a responsibility, not the title. Because elder and overseer are actually the ones used more. I think pastor is only used twice in the whole New Testament, and that in a way that makes it seem like it's a title. So it might be more accurate to say that elders and overseers are synonymous, and pastoring is just what an elder does. They care for, they shepherd the congregation. Now, this word here, aspires, is important. You see kind of here the parallel word here. He aspires to the office of overseer. He desires a noble task. I was going to ask a question, but I'll just say the way I think this is. There's been a lot of books in recent years arguing against the use of the idea of calling when it comes to ministry. So you've seen a lot of people, or maybe heard a lot of people saying, I was called to be a pastor. Has anyone heard that before? It's pretty common, right? I was called to be a pastor. I probably would have spoken in that language. Maybe I still would speak in that language. But when you look at the New Testament, you actually don't see that concept explicitly. You see more the idea of desire or aspiration. And this is one of the clearest texts in the New Testament for this. In fact, if you take all of 1 Timothy chapter 3, and then you asked, what should someone have in order to be a pastor of a church? You would probably have three things. The first one would be desire. They want to do it. The second one would be character, and that's what we're going to look at in a second. And the third one would be skill. And the only verse, I guess, that would, or one of the only ones that would reference the skill is this ability to teach. This is probably the only one out of all the characteristics that's not a character-based trait. Ability to teach is not like a virtue. It's more of a skill. So these are the three things that I kind of think should be, qualifications or requirements to be a pastor in a church. Any thoughts on that or questions? Maybe. I think the problem with it is so many people have used it in bad ways.
Yeah, I agree that.
You know what I mean?
That's pragmatic, that's
Yeah.
that people have done that, no doubt, but I also know people that have wanted to do it.
So you're saying God uses the desire to call them.
Or to respond to God's
Yeah.
initiative. I mean, I agree that, I agree with what you're saying, I'm just trying to push against it a little bit, because I've seen people with desire that don't have, and their desire, they even have the character, they don't have the skill, you know, and I've seen people, I don't know, I just.
Right. That's why I would take all three equally, probably. Yeah. Yeah. Equally. Because I don't think Paul means this here to just say I don't think he's listing things in orders of importance. He's just listing different requirements for being a pastor. And really what he's saying here is it's a good thing. Oops. It's a good thing to desire it. He desires a noble task. That's the point.
Why did he phrase it as the same as trustworthy? Is he referring to show up in his mind, not biblical text or something?
I don't know. That's a good question. That would seem to kind of say that he's borrowing it from somewhere, right? Or quoting it. Yeah, that's a good question.
And I could be wrong, but I think there's some discussion whether that applies to the verse, which is also a very strange verse.
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I think the only biblical passage that might teach calling, the idea of calling, is Ephesians 4, where Paul says that God has gifted pastors to the church, which makes it sound like it's something that God does rather than the people do. So, I don't know. All right, so anyway, he goes on here and he goes through all these character traits. And so I want to talk about them a bit and try to just get your feedback on what these look like in our culture. Because I think when you're talking about something like, take above reproach, for example, which is probably an overarching characteristic, so maybe we'll skip that one. Take sober-minded, for example. It might look one way for someone to be sober-minded in 2023 and another way in 1823. Or to say it another way, there might be some area of life that it's very important to be sober-minded in our time that it wasn't that important in 100 years ago. Does that make sense? Yeah, Caleb?
I would look at sober-minded and self-control as almost the same thing. I find it interesting that it's kind of suggesting to me that there's separate things that just next to each other like that.
Yeah, right? It kind of really wouldn't make sense for Paul to just put synonyms unless he's trying to emphasize a point or overemphasize. Now, this is one of the problems when you come to interpretation of Scripture, when you have a word where there's not really a context to help you understand the word. So there's nothing around sober-minded or in front of sober-minded that's going to help you understand what it means. That's part of the difficulty. Yeah, Ryan?
Yeah, that's what the King James text says. It says sober and of good behavior. So sober-minded is that way that self-control is controlling your actions.
Okay. So this is the way you think, and this is the way are you able to control the way you act or live or react? Is that what you're saying? That's probably a good way to distinguish it, I think.
I mean, if you think about it, trying to come up with a hypothetical, someone who runs a Ponzi scheme, right, like an extremely successful Ponzi scheme with Bernie Madoff, probably pretty sober-minded to be able to pull that off and con people out of millions of dollars. Self-control, certainly not, but I guess maybe that's an example of why those could be split. Like again,
Right.
sober-minded is about your attitude, your mentality.
Yeah. Caleb?
Yeah, I really like
Yeah. There's actually a bunch of them in this section that are, how other people see you, especially this one here in verse 7. He must be well thought of by outsiders. That's a kind of a controversial one. Because in our culture, it's kind of popular to just be like, well, I don't care what they think. Like, who cares what they think? I'm going to be who I am. But respectable kind of has that same idea. Now let's talk a little bit, because one of my pet peeves when it comes to the characteristics here, character traits, is that we be consistent. So my interpretation of this here, this one that we skipped over, the husband of one wife. In the Greek here, this literally just says, I don't know if you can see this, but one woman, man. And so I think that this is saying less about is someone married or not, or have they been married only once or not. And it's saying more about, is it true about this person that they're a one-woman type man? So that would mean it's not only about whether they're married, it's about whether they are addicted to pornography or not. Would still fall under this characteristic. It's describing, are they the type of person that is a one-woman man type of person? I think so just to be more explicit, I think if you had, for example, someone who was divorced before being a Christian, I don't think this qualification would exclude them from being a pastor. And possibly even, I don't know. It gets a little more iffy if you're talking about a Christian. But for example, let's say a Christian got divorced in their 20s. They get remarried when they're 28 and are faithfully married for 30 years. Are they a one-woman man? I think so. And so I would not disqualify that person probably. Of course, it's situation dependent. The important point is to treat all of the traits here as their character traits. They're saying, is this generally true of a person? So, for example, you wouldn't, if you take sober-minded, and if I'm a pastor and tomorrow, which this is completely possible, I have a moment in which I do not act I don't think in a sober-minded way. Would that mean that I'm disqualified from being a pastor? I don't think so. The question would be, am I a sober-minded type of person or not? Does that make sense? And so I think you need to apply that kind of thinking to all of the traits, including this one, including able to teach, which is more of a skill, including not a drunkard, including not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. Any questions on that or comments? Yeah. But again, my point here is that husband of one wife is not what the Greek says. It's an interpretation that the translator made. So the actual Greek, all it says is one woman man. So you have to decide, what does that mean? Is he making a specific statement about how many times someone was married, or is he saying that you need to be this type of person? And you can debate it, but I think if you're going to be consistent with all the other traits, he's talking about a way of life. Is this true about the person or not? I tend to think this is a misleading translation that the translators mess up. I mean, they're just humans, right? You know, a bunch of people got together and made the New American Standard and whatever.
Along those lines, show me one pastor that has met all of those requirements there in 500.
Right.
Show me one person.
Yeah. And oh, that's another good requirement. These are really just Christian requirements. And they're not any, you know, everyone who's a Christian should line up with these. They're not anything that God hasn't called any of you to. Someone pointed out, one commentator I read was like, it's actually a pretty low standard in some ways, especially in that culture. Now, I think it would be good to have some discussion if we have time. Let me see. We spent like 28 minutes getting the technology set up. So, is there any way in which these that need to be applied in our culture in particularly important ways? Another way to say it are which ones of these are the opposites prevalent in our culture? And you could probably say all of them in some respect, right? But which ones are especially important? Yeah, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money.
I mean, if you take those four and have a Christ-like approach, personality to the topics of violence, drunkenness, quarrelings, and the love of money, solve most of our societal ills.
Yeah. He said if you, tell me if I get it wrong, if you solve most of these issues, you'll solve most of the problems in our society. Is that basically what you said?
Yeah. If we lived out the Christ-like approach in these areas, and if society at large did, I just think, yeah, okay, drunkenness, expand that to any drug use, violence, quarrelings, and the love of money. It's about most of society's problems like that.
Right. I mean, if you think of America, it's almost a virtue to be quarrelsome in some ways. It's a virtue to be violent, not physically against people, but in, you know, if you connect it to the quarrelsome characteristic. It's not a virtue to be gentle in our society. That's really taken as weakness rather than a strength. The American dream, in a lot of ways, is the love of money. And so I think all of these in some ways are anti our culture. Yeah. That was one of the first dominoes to fall in our society. Yeah. Self-control is not a big one in our society, although there's a big trend towards like stoicism, kind of with a lot of young people, which is more of a self-controlled type of thing. Hospitality. Hospitality might be a virtue in our society, maybe. I don't know. Any other thoughts on any of these that are more important? Or more relevant is probably a better way to put it. Oh, I think I repeated that.
Where was the one where it says you have to be in good, you have to be in good stead or good respectful to the
Oh, verse 7.
I was wondering if you've got any correlation between the relationship with outsiders and all these characteristics. Because are our outsiders looking at these characteristics?
Oh, yeah.
Are they a measurement of, is that somehow?
I don't know. I mean, the way we were just talking, they might hate it in a lot of ways. I didn't read anything related to that, but that makes sense. The characteristics would in some ways probably make you well thought of by outsiders, especially if they're countercultural, right? Sometimes those things stand out in a good way.
I think the main thing is what you said, is these are things we in all Christians' life, but it's the consistency aspect of it that probably genders respect.
Right. So we'll like kind of skip through. It looks like I put these slides in here twice for fun, I guess. He talks about here, he must manage his own household well with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? I think this is related to the management word is related to the, oversight. And then notice that he uses the word care, which is related to the pastoring. And this makes sense. If you can't lead your family to the Lord, not in the salvation sense, but I mean just show them Christ, you shouldn't be responsible to lead a church to Christ.
So what do you think that means when it comes to the caricature of pastor kids or over the work kids?
All right, that was me. I'll use me as an example. So when I was 16, I started doing, every bad thing I could. And when my parents, consistently fought against it and tried to lead me towards what was right. And when they found out, for example, that I was smoking pot, they, pled with me for, I think, months. And by that, I mean they, tried to reason with me and encourage me and love me to do what was right. And when I wouldn't, they just kicked me out. And to me, that was managing the household well. They, I was the rebellious one. They managed me well in a sense. And that's just what I needed. I needed God to just, I needed everything to go wrong in my life so that I would see I needed Jesus. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of how I see it. Moving on here, he must not be a recent convert, or he may be puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Of course, you could debate what recent means, but the idea here, when you first get saved and get excited about the faith, you're often gung-ho and dogmatic and just ready to go. And there's good things about that and bad things about that, and conceit can follow that. All right, I want to move and talk about deacons because it's also a controversial portion of this passage. So deacons likewise. So you'll notice here he uses the word likewise, which is kind of indicating he's moving to a different group of people. So deacons likewise, and remember the word deacons just means servant. Must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine. The interesting thing here is, to use the not addicted to much wine example, a lot of the concepts here are the same as elders, but he might use different words. So when it comes to eldership, for whatever reason, he says not a drunkard, and then here he says not addicted to much wine. It seems like he's using different words to communicate the same concept. The only concept that is not in the deacons is the ability to teach. So that's the only one that's not here. Now, then in verse 9, you have this interesting verse, they must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. Does anyone remember where this is already discussed in the letter? Yeah. It's my favorite verse maybe in the whole book. He says, the goal of our instruction, this is why we're teaching, is love from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. So it's one of the central themes in the letter. He mentions it again in verse 19 to Timothy, fight the good faith, keeping faith in a good conscience. So it's important throughout the letter. I read in a commentary today a great point. He was saying Paul puts this here in the deacons because since deacons are meant to be servants that might be skill-oriented. So if you remember in Acts 6, the deacons are called to help feed the widows who weren't being fed. So they're task-oriented, right? They have a task that they need to accomplish so that the elders can preach and pray, teach and pray. The guy was saying here that Paul puts this here to emphasize that it's easy to focus on the task-oriented side of things and ignore the fact that they have to be, solid in the faith. And so he puts this here to balance the task-orientedness of deacons. That kind of made sense to me. Any questions or comments about deacons? I think he says here in verse 10, and let them also be tested first. I take this to be referring to the character qualifications. So the deacons should be tested to make sure that they're dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for a dishonest gain, and tested to make sure they hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. So if they're tested, if they prove themselves blameless, then they can serve as deacons. So any questions on that portion?
You see in the pastor section, the elder section, it says not a new convert. Do you think some of what we just discussed with deacons, you said different words, same idea. Do you see any same idea in there?
I don't think so, actually.
I wasn't sure if it was training the mystery of the faith. That's, in other words, they're not recent converts or someone that is understanding.
Maybe. But maybe it is that deacons could be more recent converts.
If they have a clear conscience, understanding the mystery of faith.
Right. Yeah, maybe that's another one that's not repeated. It's kind of an interesting section because he does elders, deacons, and then wives or women deacons, and then deacons again. It's a weird structure, so I could have missed it. Yeah, I don't think that's here. Right. So it's probably not like they came up to the altar call and got saved and then became a deacon after the service. Like, that probably didn't happen. But you're right. They had to have been tested at some level to make sure they have the character traits. Now, moving on here, this one is controversial because of the Greek here. Now, notice when he uses the word likewise, he's, kind of starting a new section in the same way that he used it here to start a new section referring to the deacons. So he moved from elders to deacons with the word likewise. Now he's moving from deacons to their wives with the word likewise. Now, this one is interesting because let me look at my, so New American Standard is typically the more literal translation. The word here, the Greek word, I think is like, you don't really care, but I think it's like gunakase or something like that. And really all it means is women. It doesn't say wives. It just says the women, I think is literally what's there in the Greek. So there's a question, how do you translate it? Do you translate it the women deacons, or do you translate it the women as in the wives of the deacons he just mentioned? Now, I think he's referring to women deacons for a couple of reasons. The main one that I think that is because he doesn't give qualifications for elder wives. And you would think if he's going, if deacon wives had to be a certain way, it would have been more important for him to say elder wives need to be a certain way. Oh, I had something else in my head that I forgot. Also, you have passages like Romans 16:1, which talks about Phoebe being a deacon. So that's how I take it. Now, this is a little confusing, especially in terms of the way that our church is structured, because the way that our church is structured right now, I don't think that women should be deacons. Basically, because our deacons right now, according to our Constitution, are more of a oversight authority holding position in the church. Does that make sense? But in the New Testament, it wasn't really that way, I don't think. Yeah.
Thought is on the qualification for elders, there is the qualification of the
Right.
It's not there for deacons or their wives slash the women.
Right.
If there was, and we know earlier in the text, I do not remember that on the page.
Right.
It does seem that there's a delineation between roles.
Yep. You had something?
One of those things where if I should say something, it's the end all scripted out, right?
Yeah.
I'm just, in our current structure, what you're referring to is exactly the deacon board. The deacon board is not the biblical model per se. It's the one that most churches have. But the board responsibilities within our church are really governing school, governing actually global non-governmental church. There are certain aspects where, I mean, if I did, the pastor's not here, then the chairman of the meeting is not.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, as we look at that, this is a highly, you've already mentioned it all the time, and I'm just wondering, I agree with everything you said. I'm not pushing it. There's just a lot of sensitivity in this area. And so you're hitting on something that we're going to be talking about more as we go forward in our own church and how this fleshes out. But to get back into the text, I was wondering if the there, can you their wives, is there any way where that's inclusive to pastors, elders, and deacons? I don't think so, but I'm asking you. Because of the context, it is odd, it goes deacons, deacons' wives, and then back to deacons where it could be, it makes sense in that whole section of deacons. And I also believe that women will be deacons in the sense of not the board model, but in terms of a certain model that you're describing. So I was just wondering if there's any way, if you know what the word there, is there any way possible, Greek-wise, where that could refer to
I th- I'm looking now to make sure, but I'm pretty sure it's not even there. I think it's actually just the. Even the might not be there. It's one of those things when you're translating, you have to add a lot of English words to make sense of it. So even literal translations, if you just put, one English word for every one Greek word, it would make zero sense. Language doesn't work that way. So you have to add, I'm almost positive it's just the, but
King James translates it as, and let these also first be proved, then let them use the office of deacon.
wait, which verse is that?
10, is that what we're talking about?
Oh no, verse 11. How does verse 11 go?
Even so must their wives be greater.
Their wives, so they do their also. I'm right there. Oh yeah, there's no the or there. It just says women. Like so women, and then you have the word likewise. Yeah, women likewise. That's why, yeah, it's
That's what I want to point out, because as people, if we're hearing this pushes against, conservative Christianity tradition, and there's a lot of sensitivity in this area, but really the language dictates what we say. If it's saying women, we all
Yeah, no.
we want women deacons. No, it's saying in the text itself, it just says women. And in the context, whether that one Gunicite, it has to, the context dictates. Right? And I'm agreeing with everything you're saying. I want people to understand, when we are teaching and preaching these things, we're not making this stuff up.
Oh, right.
I mean, these tensions are real, but the English is making it more difficult for us to understand the Greek.
Yeah, it depends on the translation. The New American Standard just puts women, but yeah. All right, so like I said, it's an interesting structure. So if I change colors here. If you have number 1, well, this is really number 2, but deacons, then he switches here to the women deacons, number 3, and then he goes back to deacons here in verse 12. So it's kind of like bookended. So deacons each be the husband of one wife. I think this is similarly also one woman man. And you can see why they would put this here in the translation. It's because they're reading one woman man and they want to explain it in English to the people who are going to read it in English. So if you're translating and you think one woman man means husband of one wife, then that's what they thought and that's what they put it there to help us when we're reading. But if you don't think it means that, then it becomes, more difficult. Notice here he also mentions the children in their own households well. This is a great verse that just speaks to the blessing of being a deacon. So it's maybe even something you should aspire to. For those who serve well as deacons, gain a good standing for themselves and also great confidence in the faith that is in Jesus Christ. And what an awesome verse. I mean, all of us want to, I think, gain great confidence in the faith of Jesus Christ, right? That's what I want. I need more confidence in the faith of Jesus Christ. And Paul is saying here that those who take this seriously and serve well as deacons, that's a result of it. So what a blessing. What an awesome blessing. We'll skip through this real quickly because we have 2 minutes, and I've read this verse every week. So this is the one where he's talking about behaving in the household of God, which is the church of the living God. And then this is a hymn that he ends the book with. Some of your versions or translations will put it kind of in poetry language. It's just talking about Christ. So he ends the chapter here with this hymn, and we'll just read it and be done. If anyone wants to talk about it next week, we can go back. He says, "Great indeed we confess is the mystery of godliness. He was manifested in the flesh, vindicated by the Spirit, seen by angels, proclaimed among the nations, believed on in the world, taken up in glory." So the mystery here referring to the gospel, and he's just building off here, really going back to this verse here, the blessing of being a deacon, talking about the faith that is in Christ Jesus. All right, any other final comments? Next week we'll start with chapter 4, going back to false teaching. Yeah. 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 I've been thinking about that a lot lately. There's this old painting from, 800 or something. It's one of the saints. I can't remember his name, but he's like sitting there and there's all these demons around him. And so I put that up in my office because of this very idea. It is tough. And the weird thing about these verses is that he's saying that the snare of the devil and the condemnation of the devil, which we could talk about what in the world that means, But these are a result of not having these character traits. So if you're puffed up with conceit, then you will fall into the condemnation of the devil. And if you are not well thought of by outsiders, you might fall into disgrace, which is a snare of the devil. And you could probably say that the other character traits also, failure in those areas, end up being a snare of the devil and a condemnation of the devil. And how many times have we seen that in our modern world, especially with the one-woman man one? I mean, how many pastors have fallen into, even in our own area, in terrible sexual sin, which is not only hurting their church, but the whole cause of Christ, and it's just horrible. Yeah, well, thank you.